My name is Franklin Ossie, and if you're listening to this right now, I need you to take a moment before I begin. What I'm about to share with you is not easy for me to say out loud. I've rehearsed it in my head probably 100 times over the past year, and it still doesn't come out the way I want it to. But I've decided that staying quiet isn't something I'm able to do anymore. Not after everything I saw, not after what almost happened to my grandson. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working in railway logistics out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. I retired 4 years ago thinking that the hardest chapter of my life was behind me. My wife, God rest her soul, passed away from ovarian cancer in 2019, and after that I moved a little closer to my daughter and her family. They were living in a suburb just outside of Saskatoon at the time, and I needed to be near people I loved. I needed to feel like I still had a reason to wake up in the morning. My daughter's name is Vivian. She's 34 years old, sharp as a tack, works in pharmaceutical administration. She married her husband 8 years ago, and they have a boy named Oliver. He was 7 years old when all of this started. The sweetest kid you ever saw in your life. He had this gap between his front teeth, and he'd whistle when he laughed too hard. I used to tease him about it every time I came over for Sunday supper. I noticed something was wrong in the autumn. It was early October, one of those Saturdays where the leaves are still holding on but you can feel the cold coming. I drove over to drop off some things from the farmer's market. Vivian loves the old cheddar from this one vendor, and when I knocked on the door, it took a long time for anyone to answer. When Oliver finally opened it, he looked at me like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to let me in. That stopped me cold. This was a child who used to sprint down the hallway and jump into my arms the second my car pulled up. He knew the sound of my engine. That's what his mother told me once, laughing. "Dad, he knows your car before you even ring the bell." And now he was standing at the door looking at me like a stranger with a clipboard. I stepped inside and tried to make it normal. I asked him how school was going. He shrugged. I asked if his friend Brendan, I asked if his friend was still coming around on weekends. He said he didn't know. I asked if everything was okay, and he nodded, but he didn't look at me when he did it. He looked at the floor. Vivian wasn't home that day. She'd taken on some overtime shifts that month. Her husband was there, working in his home office. I stayed about 40 minutes, had a cup of tea, and drove home with a stone sitting somewhere in my chest that I couldn't quite name. The next few weeks, I kept a quiet eye on things. I didn't want to overreact. I told myself that children go through phases, that Oliver was maybe having a rough patch at school, that 7-year-olds are emotional creatures, and I was just a grandfather reading too much into a bad afternoon. But then Vivian called me one evening in November, and she sounded tired in a way that was different from regular tired. She said Oliver had been sent home from school that week because he'd had a crying episode in the middle of class and couldn't stop. His teacher had asked if there was anything going on at home. Vivian said she'd told the teacher no, everything was fine. She seemed embarrassed more than anything. I didn't say what I was thinking. I asked her if she'd talked to Oliver about it herself. She said he wouldn't open up to her, that he just kept saying he didn't know why he was sad. I got off the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time looking at the wall. I started coming by the house more often after that. I'd invent reasons. I needed to return a tool I'd borrowed. I wanted to bring Oliver a book I'd found at a second-hand shop. I was passing by anyway. What I was really doing was watching. Not in a suspicious way, I told myself. I was just a grandfather keeping his eyes open. What I noticed was this. Oliver was fine when his mother was home. Not great, not the laughing gap-toothed kid I remembered, but fine. He'd eat his dinner, he'd answer questions, he'd do his homework at the kitchen table. But on the evenings when Vivian was working late and her husband was the one in charge of the house, Oliver became almost invisible. He'd disappear to his room before it was even close to bedtime, and in the mornings after those nights, he looked like he hadn't slept at all. I'm not a confrontational person by nature. My wife used to say I'd rather drive around the block 3 times than make a left turn in traffic, but something in me had shifted by the time December came around. I drove over one Tuesday evening, unannounced, and when Oliver answered the door this time, I saw something on his forearm. It was half covered by his sleeve, a bruise, oblong, the kind of shape that doesn't come from running into a doorframe or falling off a bike. He pulled his sleeve down immediately. He looked up at me and his eyes went wide with something I can only describe as terror. Not surprise, terror. I kept my voice steady. I smiled at him and said, "Hey buddy, it's freezing out here. Mind if I come in?" He stepped aside and I walked in and I sat down on the couch and I talked to him for almost an hour about nothing. Hockey, the snow, what he wanted for Christmas. I watched him slowly come back into himself, just a little, and the whole time I was sitting there I was thinking about that look on his face. That flash of fear when I'd seen the bruise. I didn't say anything to Vivian that night. I didn't say anything to anyone because I didn't have proof of anything and I was terrified of being wrong. What I did was go to a hardware store the next morning and buy a small security camera, the kind people use to monitor their front door or their garage. I told myself I was probably overreacting. I told myself this was an invasion of privacy. I told myself 12 different things on the drive home. And then I thought about the look on Oliver's face when I'd seen that bruise, and I stopped telling myself anything. I want to be honest with you here. What I did next was one of the hardest decisions of my life, and I didn't make it lightly. I called my daughter under the pretense of coming by to fix a leaky tap she'd mentioned a few weeks back. She said she'd be at work all day Saturday but that her husband would be home and he could let me in. That worked. Her husband let me into the house that Saturday morning. He was pleasant, offered me coffee, showed me the bathroom tap, and then went back to whatever he was doing. I fixed the tap. It took maybe 20 minutes. And while I was putting my tools away, I set up the camera in Oliver's room. I placed it inside a small wooden birdhouse I'd made for Oliver 2 Christmases ago, the one that sat on his bookshelf, facing the bed. I angled it slightly. You couldn't see it unless you knew what you were looking for. I drove home and I sat in my car in my own driveway for a very long time. I accessed the footage remotely through an app on my phone. For the first 3 nights, nothing out of the ordinary. Oliver going to bed, sleep. On the 4th night, a Thursday, Vivian was on an evening shift. I watched the footage the next morning with my coffee going cold in my hand. At 11:47 p.m., the bedroom door opened. Oliver was asleep. The hallway light came in. I could see the silhouette. It was her husband. He came into the room and he stood over Oliver's bed. Oliver stirred and woke up. I watched my grandson sit up in bed, and even in the low light, I could see his body go rigid. That's when it happened. Her husband grabbed him by the arm, pulled him out of the bed, and hit him across the back of the legs with what looked like a leather belt. Oliver didn't scream. That was the part that broke me open. He didn't scream. He'd learned not to. I had to put the phone down. I stood up from my kitchen table and I walked outside in my socks into the November cold, and I stood there until I stopped shaking enough to go back inside. I watched the rest of the footage. It lasted 4 minutes. Then her husband left and closed the door, and Oliver lay back down in his bed and pulled the blanket up over his face. He didn't move again. I want to tell you what I did next, and I want to be very clear about my reasoning, because I've had people ask me, people who've heard parts of this story, why I didn't drive straight over there that morning and take my grandson out of that house. The truth is, I was terrified of making the wrong move. I'd seen enough to know that if I acted impulsively, if I showed up and confronted this man, I could give him time to destroy evidence. I could make things worse for Oliver in ways I hadn't even thought of yet. I needed to do this right, not fast, right. The first person I called was my daughter. I know that sounds backwards, but I called her and I asked her to come to my house alone that morning. Before she went anywhere else, she could tell from my voice that something was serious. She was there within the hour. I sat her down at my kitchen table, and I showed her the footage. I will not try to describe what watching her watch that video was like. I don't have the words for it. I will only say that I held her hand through all of it, and when it was over, she didn't say anything for almost 3 minutes. She just sat there. Then she said, very quietly, "How long?" Not a question. 2 words, how long? I told her I didn't know. I told her it may have been going on for some time before I started noticing anything. She nodded slowly, and then she picked up her phone and she called her work and said she wouldn't be in. Then she called a number I didn't recognize. It turned out that Vivian, my daughter, had already quietly consulted with a family lawyer 2 weeks earlier. She'd noticed things too. She hadn't told me because she was still trying to convince herself she was wrong. She hadn't gone to the police yet because she was afraid. Now she had evidence on video. That changed everything. The family lawyer's name doesn't matter here, but she was very good. She told us to go directly to a RCMP detachment that day with the footage. She told us not to return to the house, not to alert the husband, and to arrange for someone else to collect Oliver from school. That's what we did. My daughter's coworker, a woman she trusted completely, picked Oliver up at school that afternoon under the pretense of a family scheduling mix-up. She brought him to a coffee shop nearby and texted Vivian when they were there. Vivian and I drove over together. When Oliver saw us walk in, he looked confused for a second. Then he looked at his mother's face and he burst into tears. We sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours. Vivian held him, and I sat across from them and drank a coffee I couldn't taste. Oliver talked some. Not everything, not all at once, but he talked. He told us it had been happening since the spring. His stepfather had told him it was a secret, that it was his fault, that if he told anyone, his mother would be upset and it would break up the family. He said he hadn't told me because he didn't want me to be sad. 63 years old, and I sat in a Tim Hortons and cried in front of my grandson. He reached across and patted my hand and said, "It's okay, Grandpa." 7 years old. What happened after that moved quickly. The RCMP opened an investigation. Child Protective Services became involved. Vivian and Oliver moved in with me temporarily. Her husband was removed from the home pending the investigation and was later charged with assault, causing bodily harm under the Criminal Code of Canada. He was also charged with breach of trust. The proceedings took several months. In the end, he pleaded guilty to 1 count of assault and was sentenced to 2 years less a day, to be served conditionally with strict terms including no contact with Oliver or Vivian, mandatory counseling, and community supervision. I will be honest with you. That sentence felt thin to me. 2 years less a day. For what he did to a 7-year-old child in his own home, in his own bed, who had learned to stop screaming, it felt very thin. But I also learned something important during those months of legal proceedings. What matters more than the sentence, in the long run, is what happens to the child who was hurt. And in that regard, slowly, imperfectly, with the help of a very patient child psychologist through the Saskatchewan Health Authority, things began to turn. Oliver started sleeping through the night again by February. He smiled at me in March, a real smile, not a performance. By the time the school year ended, his teacher told Vivian that he'd had a good spring term, that he was participating in class again, that he'd made a new friend. I got a card from him in June with a drawing on the front. He'd drawn the 2 of us fishing at the lake we went to last summer. He'd drawn us both with fishing rods and big, silly grins, and he'd written inside, "Grandpa is my favorite person." I have that card on my refrigerator. I look at it every morning. I've thought a lot about what I would say if I were talking to someone who's in the position I was in last October. Someone who has a feeling in their chest they can't quite name. Someone who's noticed a look on a child's face and told themselves they're probably overreacting. I'm here to tell you, you might not be overreacting. Children don't always cry out. They don't always run to you. Sometimes they learn very quickly that crying out makes things worse, and so they go quiet instead. They become invisible. They answer questions about school with a shrug. They flinch at things that shouldn't be frightening. They pull their sleeves down. If you see those things, trust what you're seeing. You don't need to be certain before you start paying attention. You just need to start paying attention. I'm not a brave man. I'm a retired railway logistics coordinator from Winnipeg who used to avoid left turns in traffic. But I had a grandson who learned to stop screaming, and I am never going to look away from something like that again. Not for as long as I'm alive. Oliver is 8 now. He still has that gap between his front teeth. And last Sunday when I came over for dinner, he ran down the hallway and crashed into me so hard I nearly went over backwards. I held on and I didn't let go for a long time. That's the only thing in any of this I'd say I got exactly right.